All right. So first, just a little about Gateway Greening. If you've been to some of my classes already, you've probably already heard this, but we're a nonprofit based in St. Louis, Missouri, in the United States, because I've noticed we've had a couple people from outside the United States attend these, which is great. So just a little more context of where we are, middle of the country. We help build community gardens and school gardens around St. Louis City, the St. Louis County, and parts of East St. Louis as well. So we support these projects through material grants, soil grants, tools, different things like that. And so we have over 200 of them. If you're interested in joining a community garden, kind of at the end of the growing season here in St. Louis, but looking at spring next year, definitely reach out to us. You can go to our website, you can shoot me an email, and I can connect you with garden leaders. Each one of those gardens is independently run by their community. So the best way to kind of get involved is reach out to us, and then we'll connect you with the leaders of that project. So we also have a school program. Need to update this presentation because we have more than 60 now. I think we have about 80 youth-oriented gardens. And during non-COVID times, we have educators that work in St. Louis public schools, working with teachers to help develop curriculum, but also teach classes and work on different education techniques with gardens. We also have a specific seed to stem curriculum that we use that is kindergarten through 5th grade, but also a little bit more, we're looking at expanding it into middle school. And then also volunteering. So if you're interested, not just like joining a garden, but want to come out and volunteer. Right now with COVID, we're not doing volunteer groups really, but post-COVID, we will. And we have plenty of volunteer groups. We usually have about 250 a year. They usually add up to about 10,000 hours or so. But yeah. But yeah, so maximizing growing space. So this presentation, it's a very interesting, I taught a similar one at our conference last year, and I found the structure of it's a little odd to me, so I might be jumping back and forth as I feel like the flow of the presentation goes, but because it's not as easy to make kind of like a consistent one versus like when you're talking about like growing for spring, I could start at the beginning of the spring and kind of work through it, while there's kind of a range of topics to maximize your growing space. So it's kind of a collection of tips and different things. So first we're going to just talk about kind of planning the space, things to think about, healthy soil, because that's very important. And so really good tips on maintaining healthy soil, different things on garden structures, or just like what we use and kind of some tips on that. Talking about different plants and how I kind of like when I'm doing the planning of what we're going to plant, how I think of and categorize plants in my head to maximize our space. We'll talk about a little bit of interplanting within that. And then within that planning, also kind of planning for your seasons and when to plant certain things. And then we'll go into, at the end, we'll talk about how to start early. So using row covers, different covers and things, and when to start planting things. And then how to keep your stuff, kind of your cool season stuff through your summer or a little bit longer into the summer, and then how to extend your season into the fall and winter. We won't go super detailed on a lot of that because we have actually specific classes on that, which I think we have on YouTube. I also have the presentations, so we can also send those out too. But first, when you're thinking about where to start with your planning and planting, if you don't have a garden set up, you want to make sure sunlight. Sunlight is probably will be the most important limiting factor on where you're growing. So those of us in the Northern Hemisphere, you want good southern sun and eastern sun for us in the US, or yeah, anywhere. And so I like this graphic a lot because it shows the difference between where you can get where winter sunrise is and where a summer sunrise is. For kind of the middle of the United States. This orientation changes based on your latitude, but it's nice to see for like summer sun, you could even be planting on the north side of a structure and you'd be fine. But if you wanted to really, again, maximize that growing space and get lots of stuff growing early in the spring, late in the fall, you need to make sure you're getting sunlight that's coming from the south. Think about placing in this kind of southern area, this really excellent location from this diagram. But yeah, so always making that point. Definitely that's also the same with if you're growing indoors as well. You want lots of sunlight and southern sun. So I always just make that point. But yes, healthy soil. So I'm going to go through kind of a couple tips on healthy soil. I mean, soil, as probably most of us know, it's a mixture of organic materials, living organisms, and minerals. And that combination will really determine how healthy that soil is. And so when you're thinking about your growing space and growing over a long time and trying to get the most out of your garden bed or whatever you're growing, thinking of feeding and keeping your soil healthy is one of the best ways to get the most out of your growing area. So specific to St. Louis, a lot of our soil definitely, if you're growing directly in the ground, we have a lot of heavy clay soil, which that means is it doesn't drain well. It can become very compacted. And because of this lack of drainage, it also can really get kind of hard and retain a lot of water. So really, if you're going to be growing in the ground, which if you're growing in the ground in St. Louis, the city or the county, or even really in East St. Louis, I'd highly recommend looking at getting a soil test specifically for soil contamination. We have a lot of heavy metal contamination, lead, and a couple other metals that are pretty common in heavy industry that has contaminated quite a bit of the soil. So for us at Gateway Greening, whenever we do gardens, we always bring in soil. We do raised beds or berms or things like that. But if you are looking at doing in-ground, the University of Missouri Extension Agency does pretty low-cost soil testing. It's also nice to do soil testing. You can look at your nitrogen and phosphorus levels and some other nutrient level loads that can give you some better ideas of what if you need to add nutrients to the soil. So, but if you are mixing in compost, some green manures, you can even mix in some straw, some other things that really just kind of bulk up and like loosen up those heavy soils. Animal manure, really recommend finished, but if you're not going to be growing in it for a while, you could do an unfinished animal manure as well. So, but other ways, if you already have your garden bed and maintaining your healthy soil, first, don't leave dead plant material in your beds in the fall. So this time of the year, you should be pulling out anything that you're not planning on keeping alive through the winter. So any of your summer crops, tomatoes, squashes, things like that, pull those out. In the spring, before planting, really recommend adding in some compost. This picture right here is kind of a nice little technique of throwing the compost on the bed, and really from there, instead of turning the soil, because that's one way to incorporate it, but really full tillage of the soil, you can lose a lot of nutrients and really break up the microbes. It's a better idea to like throw this kind of couple inches of compost on top and then take a digging fork, which looks basically like a big fork, and just kind of stick it into the ground and just loosen the soil, kind of move it back and forth. That forward and backward motion will let the compost kind of fall within the soil, but it won't fully break up your soil profile so that you're still building a healthy soil. And then as you're growing through the season, and say you're kind of partway into the summer and you're pulling out your spring crops and you're planting some summer stuff, would recommend also adding a little bit more mulch or compost, like a leaf mulch, not really like a wood mulch or a straw mulch. That won't add any nutrients to your soil. But a leaf mulch or compost will, and that not only protects the soil from kind of drying out, but then as it breaks down, it adds nutrients to your soil as well. So, also another really good technique for maintaining healthy soil is cover crops. There's quite a few different options. I'm not going to go super deep into it here because there's quite a bit of stuff, but if you really ever have a time when you're growing in your bed or any berms and you have basically nothing in there, and you're going to have basically almost a whole season, whether it be from fall, winter into early spring, or maybe you're not growing something over the summer. A lot of our school gardens don't grow stuff over the summer, so we have some summer cover crops we recommend. Keeping something growing in the soil is good for the soil. So that's where cover crops can come in. We actually have a whole class on this, and if you're interested in it, I can at least send you the presentation after you get this one. But really, if you're doing a cover crop or doing like a rye and vetch or a Japanese millet or something, you can do a full tillage like in this picture in the recommendations here, or you can do a tarping system, which is right here, where you kind of flatten your mulch, your cover crop into a mulch, and then you cover it with a tarp or cardboard or something like that. Cutting it at ground level, and we usually use like just a big 2x4 and just knock it over. And then if you cover with a tarp for about 3 weeks or so, you've pretty much broken down all of that cover crop, and you can start planting. With this technique, works really well with planting transplants, which also for maximizing growing space is really recommended. The thing with all cover crops in general is you want to make sure you are killing them or knocking them down before they start, when they start to flower and before they go to seed. So, yeah, and somebody's asking about making leaf mulch. Actually, that's a good, I think we covered that in a class a couple weeks ago, but I will make the point because this is the perfect time to make leaf mulch right now, since we had just pretty much all of our leaves fall down here in St. Louis. Would recommend what you should do is rake them all up. So first you should save them, rake them up. What we do is we take a chicken wire and take some T-posts and wrap around the chicken wire around the T-posts, and we just put the leaf mulch, the leaves, into a large pile and try to make it as tall as possible, usually about like 4 or 5, like about 4 feet or so. So it's a pretty tall set of leaves, and then that through the winter, so we do that in the fall, because then in the winter we get this, like, they freeze and then they thaw and they freeze and then they thaw, and that freeze and thaw breaks them down a lot, which then eventually turns into kind of a leaf mold leaf mulch, which is pretty good. Also, whenever I'm kind of using leaf mulch, you can also use like a compost, which the city of St. Louis and quite a few cities in St. Louis County have some pickup sites that you can grab compost from for free. We actually have those on our website as well, so you can take a look at those. But using that also as a leaf mulch is a really good way too. So, all right. So layout and design. So a couple other just basics I like to break up into: raised beds or in-ground planting versus berms or containers. I have preference for the raised bed or the raised berm. I think bringing in your own soil allows you to, first, you can reduce weeds by putting down some cardboard, and really which helps a lot with weeding, but then also you can control what is in your soil because you're bringing it in. It is a little bit more expensive, but you are, regardless of where you're doing in-ground planting, you're going to have to supplement with nutrients anyways. So I think like a berm or a raised bed. Containers, if you don't have any other option, obviously growing something over nothing, growing in containers is great. The one thing with containers is, because there's a lot less soil, they dry out a lot faster, they lose their nutrients a lot faster. We actually have a whole class coming up that we're teaching virtually through the St. Louis County Library on growing in containers. I think it's next Tuesday. So if you go over to St. Louis County Library's website, you can look and see how to sign up for that. And we go through how to grow through containers as well. But so a little bit about raised beds, because we do a lot of them. And so people always have questions on them, and just some kind of general tips. First, I wouldn't really go much wider than 4 feet. We have 5-foot wide beds. I've seen some 6 foot or 8 foot. The problem is any wider than 4, you really can't grow in the middle of the bed. So 4 feet I find is you can actually reach the middle of the bed pretty easily. And really any longer than 12 feet, the boards really start to bend. You start losing, basically boards start pulling apart because of the pressure from the soil. And because of that, then you have to start replacing the boards a lot sooner. And then one big thing for getting the most out of your space with this is really overfill your beds. This picture actually should, I would say, even more than what's in this picture, is you want it to have quite a bit of a mound in the middle. So where it's level to the edges on the sides with a mound in the top, like the middle, it adds probably about like 10 to 15% more growing space with that curve. So it allows you to get more growing, and then also that soil is going to be settling every year anyways. So you might as well prepare ahead of time and add more soil and then get more growing space out of it. When you're putting any of these raised beds or berms or any of this stuff in the ground, definitely put cardboard below it before you put them on there. Definitely if you're growing on grass, which most people are, that cardboard will smother the grass and really slow down any of those weeds or grasses getting into the bed. If you don't, you'll have grass poking out of your garden bed probably in like 2 weeks after you build it. So, and then look at using a rot resistant wood. I know a lot of people use cedar, Douglas fir. We primarily use a copper treated pine. It's the most cost effective of them all. It doesn't have any of the problems of previous treatment programs of like the arsenic or different things like that, and it's really rot resistant. If you use an untreated wood, you're looking like in a couple of years, you're probably gonna have to start replacing it because the rot's already settled in. So, or you can use another material. You can use bricks, you can use pretty much anything. If you think about it, really all it is doing is just holding in some soil. So whatever holds in soil well that doesn't leach into that soil is a great choice. So we're going to jump a little bit. I guess I did want to mention a little bit about animal pests because we always do have some questions: deer, rabbits, squirrels. So fencing in general, just good recommendations. Squirrels, I still don't know of great ways to prevent them. Some people say putting water out because they're really just eating your tomatoes because they're thirsty. I have found that isn't as effective. They still eat the tomatoes. Rabbits, really just like low fences work well. For squirrels, we've done like full cages where we've covered beds and all the way around in chicken wire. That keeps them out. It does make it hard for you to get in there and like prune tomatoes or harvest peppers or things like that. And then deer, really deer fences seem to be the most effective, which you can buy at stores. So, but okay, so once you've kind of built your beds, you've put them in the right place, you got to think about what we're growing and where. So we're going to talk mostly about annual plants and talk about kind of really the techniques of. I do actually have some examples of some bed layouts that we did this year at our demonstration garden, and I'm kind of just going to go through it. I do prefer to teach this class in person because we can actually look at the layouts as they exist, and we can talk about why the layout works and different things like that. And also the examples I have are only, we're gonna have 3 sets of examples. There's plenty more where that came from. So if you do have questions of different layouts or combinations, that's definitely where to put in for the Q&A. But yeah, so first when laying out, I like to write out kind of all the plants we want to grow for the year. And then kind of ranking them on what we prefer. So we work a lot with food pantries here in St. Louis of where the produce goes. And then also our volunteers really put out what they want to grow. So they give us a list. And so usually our list involves, we are going to be growing collard greens. We're going to grow kale, okra, tomatoes, some peppers, and then like a winter squash. Those are usually like the ones that, all right, we are growing for sure. And then kind of farther down the list, it's like, all right, radishes, lettuces, carrots, things like that. Doesn't mean we're not going to grow them, but it means those first ones is really where we're figuring out where we're going to grow. And so then once we have that list, I like to break, and this is really just, this is how I like to think of it, breaking plants into kind of short-term and long-term, or really like what ones take up a little less space versus ones that take up a lot of space. So I take that ranking, and usually people like the ones that take up the most space, if you notice, for my ranking, the ones that we grow the most, none of those are in this list. So what that means is I look at our long-term plants and figure out where they're going to go first, and rank and basically put those in the ranking. And we're going to jump to there. Yeah. So I put those in, and we use a crop rotation, basically of those locations where we're going to put our tomatoes, our peppers, and things like that. And then from there, I figure out where we can stick these kind of short-term plants and where the good pairings go. Now I think I have a little slide on companion planting. I find a lot of the companion planting, there isn't a ton of great research on the like basil and tomatoes work well together because the basil repels certain things. There isn't a great research on that other than with of edible plants of the allium family, so onions and leeks. There is quite a bit of evidence showing that they do repel quite a few small soft-bodied insects like whiteflies. So using onions around a lot of brassicas works pretty well. And so the nice thing also with onions is you can kind of stick them almost anywhere and they grow well. So we usually do, and you'll see in our examples, we stick the onions kind of on our borders and our corners. They really just kind of get stuck wherever. So, and then a note on some other plants. I find if you really are trying to maximize the growing space and get the most out of everything you want, and you only have a few raised beds or a few spaces, melons, potatoes, sweet potatoes, and winter squash all take up a lot of space. When we grow sweet potatoes, it's like, all right, they're getting a whole bed. Same with potatoes. And you really can't pair them well with other plants. We tried doing a potato and leek bed this year where we interplanted leeks with potatoes. And the potatoes were fine, they did great. The leeks really didn't turn out well because of how the mulching worked. We couldn't add enough mulch onto the leeks to get that nice white stem and then also not smother the potatoes too much. And so really the interplanting with a lot of these are tough to do because of how much space they need. And really they spread so much they take over. I'm not saying don't grow these, but if you're looking at trying to like get the most out of your space and you only have a few beds, these ones you want to just look at buying these from the store. Now, if you do have a whole bed where you have too much space and you don't want to grow, like you just are like, well, I have all this space, I can't handle all these beds. Turning a whole raised bed into sweet potatoes is a great way to where basically the only time you're really working with the sweet potatoes is when you plant them. And then you just have to maybe do a little bit of weeding for about a week or two. And then you just let them sit there until you have to harvest them at the end of the year. But if you're maximizing growing space, also cost-wise, potatoes and sweet potatoes are pretty cheap versus if you're growing lettuces or tomatoes or things like that. So a little bit about laying out the bed, and then crop rotations. So if you do have a couple raised beds or a couple spaces that you're planting that are separate sets of soil, it is probably a good idea to think about rotating crops. Most crop rotations use a 4-year rotation. So that means every 4 years, the crop of that family isn't in that spot until the next 4 years. Now, that makes it pretty tough, definitely for us growers that, we don't want, if we followed these like perfectly, it means we'd have a quarter of our beds for like this example, quarter of our beds every year would be a legume of some sort. Also with our interplanting and like planting a bunch of stuff around each other, it starts getting really complicated with crop rotations. Because you're like, well, I planted carrots and tomatoes in the same bed, so how does this crop rotation work? And that is a good point. So really with crop rotations, what I like to focus on, and when I do our crop rotations for our demonstration garden, is I look at the fruiting vegetables. So I look at our cucumbers, our tomatoes, our squashes, eggplants, peppers, those type of plants. They have the most pests after them. They also have the most soil-borne pests, so those that overwinter in the soil. And so I look at those ones and I look at the ones in the same families. So tomatoes, definitely try to do 3 to 4 years, we don't have tomatoes in the same bed. Squash is also the number 2 probably after that. Of summer squashes and winter squashes, we also rotate those. Now like leaf vegetables and legumes, it's like, oh dang, not as big of a deal. It is nice to do a fruiting vegetable and then go right after. So not this rotation, but use like a bean or a legume afterwards. It adds nitrogen to the soil, which is great. And there's also very few pests that attack them. So you're really limiting that pest population in general. So when you're looking at crop rotations, think about, if you're wanting to start getting involved in them, look at the fruiting ones first, and really just try to move them around. I do get a question a lot of, if you only have one bed, is rotating crops like even useful if you only have one bed? Probably not, but also you might as well try. So if you had tomatoes on one side, and as long as they're not going to block out sun or anything by moving them to the other side, you might as well. The worst that happens is you just have to walk to the other side of the bed the next year for the tomatoes. So just think about it. It really is a good way. There's a reason farmers have been using crop rotations for thousands and thousands of years. So yeah. So a little bit also, if you're looking at trying to maximize that space, think about succession planting, because if you grow maybe a whole raised bed full of carrots and you harvest them all at once, now you have hundreds of, like, you have 100 pounds of carrots or tons of carrots, and you're like, well, what am I going to do with all these carrots? So if you think about doing some succession planting, this works great really for direct seeding and for root vegetables. It also works well for lettuce and cabbages, but anything that you basically harvest and you take away. So we do it a lot with our carrots and radishes and turnips. And so in the spring, once it's starting to get warm, so like around March, we start planting those root crops, and we'll do basically every week, we'll plant a row of carrots, radishes, and turnips, and then the next week we'll do another row of carrots, radishes, and turnips. And so it'll allow us to basically, after that, about every week, once they've reached maturity for about 4 weeks or so, because usually we do about 4 weeks of succession, we'll have full-size vegetables to pull out. The one thing is with succession planting in the spring is the later you do the planting, we're starting to get more sunlight. So those plants that you plant later, so that 4th week of carrots might actually catch itself back up to that week 3 of carrots, just because of how much more sunlight those plants are getting. But it's a really good way to try to spread out your harvests. And I think it's really cool to see. Here's a nice little picture of some different, these look like, yeah, radishes growing at different weeks. And definitely with those fast growing plants like radishes, where you can get some in 30 days or so, you can really see the difference very quickly. So a lot of our school gardens do this as well. So, all right. And so then once you've kind of figured out your layout and your plan, you have to think about the timing. So like I was talking about those succession plantings. Here's our vegetable planting calendar. Now this is for the St. Louis region for a frost date, a last frost date of April 15th and a first frost date of around October 20th. But yeah, using this to then also figure out when to plant is also very important. And then thinking of, so not only looking at those short-term and long-term plants after you've kind of categorized what you want versus like big ones and little ones, thinking about when you can start planting those as well. And so I'm not going to really go through this full list because we'll send it out later, but just making sure you're planting at the right time and your summer vegetables are coming in after your last frost date. So, and then, so thinking about layout of beds. So now that you've figured out kind of what you're going to grow, really the big thing is first, when you're sticking your raised bed, is thinking about those long-term bigger plants. So those kale, collards, tomatoes, and sticking those in the bed first of your design. If it's going to be a vining plant, is it going to grow up something? Are you going to do vertical growing, which is definitely recommended? And then you do, like, say you want some more root vegetables, that's really where you can stick those in at later dates. So some examples would be like, if you're going to grow tomatoes in a bed, but you have to, I mean, tomatoes aren't going in until about May here, starting in that bed with some greens and maybe some radishes and lettuce, where those tomatoes will eventually go, because by the time you're planting those we go back, by the time you're planting those in about mid-March, by mid-April, a lot of the lettuce and radishes will be coming out just in time for your tomatoes or peppers or something else to go right in as well. And then a good thing I really like to do is if you still like have some extra space around and it's still in the cool season, so you still have spring or fall, and you have some extra lettuce seed, just using it as like a loose leaf lettuce instead. A lot of one of like the standard planting kind of sets I do a lot is taking, we do like half a bed of loose leaf lettuce, just like full half bed. And then when it's time to plant tomato transplants, we actually just dig up part of the loose leaf lettuce and stick the tomatoes in. And usually we'll still get about three weeks or so after the tomatoes are planted of more lettuce harvests, which the tomatoes really haven't grown yet. So there's still a ton of lettuce on the lettuce below it. They're still getting lots of sunlight. And then also that lettuce being on top of the soil is really just good for the soil in general. It's not just bare soil. So, and then when you're also planting, a lot of like, you'll see on seed packets, it'll be like, put this much space between rows and plants. It'll be like, you want for carrots, it'll be like 2 inches between, it'll be like an inch between plants, and it'll be like 8 inches between rows. Really a good way is to actually not think of planting in a bed as rows, but think of it more as triangles. So definitely with like transplants, like lettuces and tomatoes, is really like you do a row, like you do 2 with the distance that they say. So if it's 10 inches for a head of lettuce, you do 10 inches between the 2 in kind of the same row. And then that opposite row next to it, you're planting in between those 2. So it kind of makes the shape of a triangle. And that not only maximizes the growing space, it means you can also plant a little bit tighter than what it says on the seed packets or the recommendations. Now I wouldn't recommend going too much tighter because while you can cram a bunch of stuff close together, it's not going to grow to full size, which then you're really not getting that much out of your space. So also definitely recommend trellising, and even more than just the standard, like, yes, you can grow up beans, you can also grow up peas and things like that, and cucumbers, but also think about growing up maybe like squashes, like winter squash. As long as they're not like really giant pumpkins or things like that, the squash will be able to hold itself up. So that really can get a lot of space out of your bed. Also thinking you can even grow melons. If you're really interested in growing melons, you can grow melons as a trellis. You do need to find something to support the actual melon once it's on the vine. We've done some like almost hammocks out of like old t-shirts that work pretty well. The one problem with that is it's sometimes hard to tell when the melon is done because it's not resting on anything. But that, I mean, growing tomatoes, you can do, I like this little picture here because it actually doesn't really show it great from this angle, but this, how these beans are growing up, it's actually angled out away from the bed. So it's even allowing more space, and like the beans don't even need that much space for it. So really thinking about doing some vertical growing is really good. And then, oh yeah, sorry, I am dealing with the Q&A right now. Yeah, so like I said, yeah, squashes, melons, peas, things like that. Also, the great thing with trellising is not only to make it more efficient to water at the base of the plants, but you can also, it's a lot easier to find pests on them if it's right there, so you don't have to bend over and reach to it. So highly recommend it. We use a lot of cattle panels that you can buy at a lot of farm stores. They're pretty inexpensive and they're just heavy metal, which is really nice. You can also build a lot of things out of wood. You can really, I've seen people use like old chairs and just kind of like lean them up next to the beds. There's a lot of ways and a lot of things that you can grow. So just a little bit. So we're going to go into kind of some examples, and I'm going to talk about some specific things of why we do certain things. Here's just kind of a layout of our demonstration garden from this past year of where we stuck things. It's probably like, there's a lot of stuff. What does it mean? But yeah, we'll dive in. Oh yes, and then one little thing also about companion planting I mentioned earlier. But also, if you're looking at doing herbs or different things like that and where to stick those, I really like sticking them into the corners of beds, just because it gets them out of the way, or putting them at the end of like a berm or something like that, which is like this example here. There's some chives at the end of this bed of collards and onions. It's nice because you still get them, but you don't really have to worry about them kind of in between a lot of the plants that you're pulling in and out, since most herbs that you're growing will be perennials. So, a little bit about layout of the bed before we go into kind of ours is when we're doing our layout, we look for those small cool season crops. Definitely in the spring, we're planting on the south side of our beds to get the most sunlight. And then on those north sides, we're planting our bigger warm season crops. So tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, okra, things like that. The one thing is actually, I need to move this a little bit further in. We usually plant those kind of in the middle of the beds, because when you are growing in the fall, so this first one is for the spring, the second one is for the fall, you can use those large plants to keep those cool season plants a little more shaded, which keeps them cooler in the fall when you're planting, which here in Missouri, our fall when you're planting a lot of these can be around August for a lot of these, like carrots and things like that. And it could still be like 95, 100 degrees outside. And so just to give the carrots or lettuces or any of these other cool season plants a little bit more shade and a little more protection from the sun, planting on the north side of some tall plants is a really good idea. And it's just a simple way of just how you're laying out the bed to be more effective. So yeah, we're gonna go with a little example. I'm gonna kind of go through it quick because I know we're running out of time and I want to talk about some extension stuff a little bit. But here's an example of, yeah, us growing some dino kale and collards and doing some succession planting of some lettuce here on the left side. And like I said, we stick onions kind of all over the place. So doing a border of onions around. And those border of onions will stay through partway through the summer, and we'll eventually replace it with actually a fall planting of some root vegetables. This kale and collards will stay in the bed for pretty much the entire season. You can pull these out once it gets to the summer because they look really ugly and they don't really produce much over the summer when it gets really hot, which is your choice if you want to do that. I find we have plenty of beds, so we don't need to, but if you're really trying to really you want to pull them out and get something growing, after that, maybe like a squash or something like that where you can plant it later in the summer and still get a lot of production out of it. And then this left side is head lettuce that we would be doing, we did some succession planting of. And so we started in March, and these would be coming out as seedlings. So we'd be planting these as transplants. It doesn't work as well as seed because it's a transplant, but it does give us a little bit of a succession. So here's a nice little example of a different bed, but us using those onions as a border around some kale and collards. I felt like throwing this in here to show it. The nice thing with this is, even with how those collards in the back look like they're crowding out those onions, the onions still grow to full size, really because the height of the kale and collards gets tall enough to where they kind of get out of the way of the onions. So. And then same with that same bed, leaving the dino kale and collards. We threw some bush beans in when the lettuce came out. You could also do a squash instead if you wanted, because that also could be planted a little bit later in the summer. It doesn't need to be planted right away to get production. And then after the fall, we've already pulled those onions out. The bush beans are coming out. We probably pull them out a little bit early, probably in around August, maybe September, if we were thinking about putting these carrots and radishes over the winter. And then we would plant with some rows of those, again, leaving those dino kale and collards. And then that space where we had those onions, thinking about putting a root crop in around the edges. There's some nice space there. It also definitely is radishes. And collards, it keeps them a little bit more shaded because these plants are a little bit over them, which is great. So that's one example. I'm just making sure we have plenty of time so I can make it. Yeah, I'm gonna go through this one and then we'll probably jump to the season extension stuff. So a little bit of this spring bed 2. So this bed, we had some peas on a trellis on the north side of this bed. So we had plenty of sun for all these ones on the south side. And then we did kind of a double succession of, we planted a bunch of root crops of carrots, radishes, turnips, and beets on this left side around March. And then we waited, looks like 3 weeks, 2 weeks. And then we planted carrots, radishes, turnips, and beets again to really make sure we had a big difference in the succession, so we weren't getting everything at once. And so then once those come out, the one thing is if you're planting some root vegetables like this in the space for that long, you're not going to have time really. If you want to make sure they're all in there, you're not going to have time to really, you could plant some tomatoes or some other longer summer plants, but you're not going to get as early of a harvest as if you just kept that bed open and then planted your tomatoes in May, because a lot of these aren't, definitely the second set of carrots and turnips and beets aren't probably going to be coming out till mid-May at least, if not June. And so you're really, you could just dig some out and plant some tomato plants. That's also an option too. And just get them out of the way, and then the tomatoes are already in the ground. Or if you were doing this bed and you weren't doing tomatoes, really, when I think of our summer plantings, I think of like kind of an early summer planting of crops, and then there are certain crops you can do a late or a second succession of summer planting, not only just because you're filling space, but also for pest reasons. So like zucchini and yellow squash and other summer squashes. If you do have any trouble with like vine borers, if you're at a latitude around St. Louis or north, they usually only have one one full generation. So if you do a later planting around like late June or so, sometimes even the 4th of July weekend, planting some of these, and same with cucumbers is also a good one. They're so quick to maturing that you can get a really great harvest still out of them, and sometimes even avoid most of the pests. So this year we did a late planting of zucchini, and usually at our demonstration garden, we just have every pest imaginable because we've been growing there for so long. And then that zucchini, I mean, it lasted all the way till frost, which is probably the first time I've ever seen it happen there. So it's pretty impressive. And then we've also pulled those peas out because they're coming out pretty early. And we're putting some butternut squash on there on that trellis, which we're understanding that it's going to be on there all the way through the rest of the growing season. And then through the fall, that butternut squash is still up there. Maybe the summer squash we have down here, maybe it died from some pest, or maybe we just finally decided to give up and pull it out. And we threw in some cabbages, loose leaf salad mix, and then some collards. The thing is, the way I point this out, the cabbage and collards, it's definitely good to plant those from transplant, definitely in the fall, just for how hot it is in Missouri in the fall, and then how quickly our frost can come. It's really best to be planting from transplants for cabbages, collards, lettuces, and kales and things like that, because it gets you enough of a head start to where the plant's pretty established, so the heat isn't going to hurt it as much versus if you did a seed. And then also it's going to be large enough by the fall that it'll be able to survive some cold, but also keep kind of growing after the sun's really dropped down. So, and then some spinach and winter carrots, definitely for fall planting carrots, probably by the time the squash came out. We put carrots in here expecting them to be grown through the winter, and we'd harvest them either over the winter or in the spring. So, all right, so a little bit, so we got about 10 minutes, so I'm gonna kind of go through some other extension and some stuff like that. So first with mulching, if you're really growing any non-root plants, it's a really good idea to think of some type of mulch that's going to be on the soil. That's why if you don't have like plants on there, covering the soil with something is good. moderates the soil temperature, it conserves that soil, and it keeps the weeds down. And then depending on what kind of mulch you use, it actually can add nutrients to the soil. So if you're using straw or wood mulch, it's not going to be adding nutrients to the soil, but leaf mulch or just compost or something like that, that will definitely add. This is a nice little picture. So if you're doing anything over the winter, I see somebody asking about broccoli, is pretty small. If it started to head by now, it's probably going to be fine. You're probably going to get some broccoli out of it. What you should do is with if you have any like broccoli or kale or collards in the ground right now, adding some mulch around the base, like this kind of picture right here, will help moderate the soil temperature around it, and it'll keep the plant growing. Even like if there is a pretty good frost, it'll actually protect the soil quite a bit. So once you start getting into fall, think about mulching. But the biggest thing when you're growing into the fall to think about is really when we start to drop below 10 hours of sunlight. Once our day length drops that much, a lot of growth pretty much stops in most plants. Really, you want to get to about, I think they say 75 or 80% growth by you hit that Persephone day of less than 10 hours. Here in St. Louis, ours are November 18th to January 23rd. And so really you want to make sure you're planting early, and that means you have to plant pretty early in the fall when you're looking at planting. And the thing is, when you're looking at those days to maturity on seed packets or different plants, if you're planting in the fall, I always add about 2 weeks to what they say, so about 14 days. That's because those days to maturity on those seed packets are all based off of spring plantings. So it's based off the plant getting more and more sunlight every single day. And we're just getting more day length, so it's expecting more. So as the day length drops, the plant slows down its growing. Now, if the plant's bigger, that drop is less than a small plant, which is good. There are a few plants like spinach that isn't really like day length isn't as big of a factor, but it is still a factor in its growth. So, like I was saying, yeah, 75%. So yeah, a little bit about season extension. So if you've got some cool season crops in the ground now going into the fall, some things to think about, and we do have a whole class on this, so I can send over slides if you want. Just let me know. But can increase temperatures usually around 2 to 7 degrees. That really depends on the fabric strength of these row covers. And all of these you really want to use in combination with mulch. I really like this picture because it shows these like PVC rings underneath this cloth. It's just called a row cover. And really you just need something to hold it up to where it's not touching the plant. So there's kind of an air gap in this, and then something to hold down the cloth on the sides. So you can use garden staples. I've seen a lot of people use bricks or rocks to hold the sides, whatever you find is the most effective. I find either way works pretty well. And if you do the rock way or like bricks or things like that, you can probably have the stuff work for multiple years. The problem with the staples is you're putting a hole in it, so it can easily tear. So, some other good examples. So you can either attach them to the sides. You can just like stick them straight into the ground. That's usually what I do. I just stick the PVC straight into the ground. There's also some metal rings. Here's a really nice design that uses actually a cow panel as the frame, which is a good idea. They're using plastic on this, which also increases temperature. The one thing is when you're using the cloth, it allows moisture to come in and out, so it's not going to get as humid inside. Anytime you're using plastic or like a cold frame, so like here, using glass, you're going to have quite a bit of humidity in there if the temperatures are swinging, which us in the Midwest know that we can have winter, like it can get very cold at night, and then we can get up to 60 degrees during the day. And if that happens, it's a good idea to open up if you're using a cold frame. So they need to be, really, I think if it's like over 45 or 50 degrees and it's a clear day, you should be opening up your cold frame. I kind of lean more into the row covers versus cold frames, because with row covers, you can use larger plants. So if you look at this kind of picture right here, there's some kale farther up. that looks like it's probably too large for these cold frames. And usually in general, large plants like kale and collards are too big for them, while they could fit underneath a row cover. Now it's a little less temperature protection, but a lot of like, if you're growing some of the varieties, most kale can handle pretty cold temperatures, but there's some other varieties that can really handle cold temperatures. So a row cover can usually keep it through the winter. Yeah, and some other pictures of cold frames. So, and then extending your kind of cool season into the summer. Now, not every place needs this. I find in Missouri we do, and I really like using a shade cloth. So basically it adds some shade and keeps the plants underneath a little bit cooler. It works. I really like it because you can almost just take off row cover and put a shade cloth on top. And so it's not like I have to do like a whole new thing. It's just putting a different type of cloth on. There's different, just like with row cover, there's different shade amounts. So I don't really know like really the best recommendations. I find we just kind of get the standard. I think it lets in like 80% of light or something like that. But it works really well for like carrots or beets or lettuces that you're planting maybe later into the spring and you're really worried about those hot temperatures. So that shade can really, it can help with some temperature, but it really is nice that it keeps them cooler at night because it keeps the soil cooler at night. And a lot of plants that bolt or go to seed, so like lettuces or different things like that over from the summer, day length is a major trigger, but also warm nights is a pretty big trigger too. So if you can keep that soil cool during the day, it'll keep the plant healthier and keep it growing longer too. So let me see. Yeah, facing south. Oh, interesting. I have this. I would ignore the text on this. This is the text for a row cover versus shade cloth. But for a shade cloth, really you do mulching again also. It kind of is funny to think that like, oh, you mulch to keep the plants warm in the winter, and you also mulch the plants in the late spring, early summer to keep them cool, but it's because it moderates the soil temperature. So it prevents those large swings. So mulching again around even your root plants, like this is some beets right here, mulching around them will also keep them cooler too. A little bit also I just like, because we're talking about row covers and things like that, insect netting I find is really great. It looks a lot like row cover, but it actually provides no temperature protection. It's a really nice netting that really, I mean, as long as you don't trap insects inside of it, it keeps insects off of plants. It does the same technique where you put it over like PVC pipes or things. The nice thing with this is you can water through it. So if you're looking at like kale or collards or like some cool season plants and keeping them, you have a lot of problems with pests or bugs into the summer. Thinking about putting an insect netting will let you keep harvesting through that. And it really keeps a lot of them off. Now, if you trap pests in it, you're really just like creating a great home for them. So if you're looking at doing insect netting, definitely on like some spring crops going into the summer, it's good to do it before the pests show up. So think about like when you start seeing some of those pests, so like maybe late April, early May, you start seeing them, you should probably be putting the insect netting on a couple of weeks before that. So also, again, I just didn't change the text. All right, and so then that's kind of the summary of it. Really thinking about those frost dates, planting those herbs in those corners of beds. I know I mentioned just a little bit, but I think it's good. And of those like companion plantings and kind of pest management techniques, having lots of different flowering plants in your raised beds is a really good pest strategy because you're just attracting a lot of wildlife into your bed. And so you're also not only attracting, like pests are being attracted by the plants that you want to eat, but you're also attracting pollinators, which then can bring in some of those other insects that attack pests as well. So, and really think about like all those empty spaces in your garden bed, as long as it's not like the middle of the summer, you can always fill those with like some lettuces, radishes, some other kind of root vegetables. They don't need a ton of space. And you can always go back and thin them if they kind of start to get too many. And really, when you thin them, you can also, that's like kind of like microgreens you're eating. So other ways to get some good produce out of that. But really, I think planning is the biggest thing. So really just kind of writing that out of what you want to grow and what you're interested in. And the way I like to think of it, like with the short term and long term, is just my way. There's plenty of other ways to think about it. And doing some Googling on reading some other ways is always a good thing to do too. So, but yeah, I'm going to stop the recording now. If anybody has any questions, start throwing them in the chat. I think I answered, or in the Q&A, I think I answered